This is my AEP 855 Module 14 case study. I'm starting out with Section 1, the case and establishing the facts. This case study focuses on the challenges that appear when ethics and policy collide. So for this case, Richard Inman was a first-year assistant principal of a junior high school and was skilled at connecting with students from the south side of their town. One of these students is named James, who was a particularly rough student who many considered the leader of this group. One particular day, Mr. Inman had called James to his office to discuss his tardies for that week. Before James made it to the office, his teacher called Mr. Inman back to inform him that James had handed something off to another student named David right after he was summoned to the office. The teacher believed that drugs might be involved and said that David was acting nervous. The second student, David, was an honor student and a standout trombone player in the band. So Mr. Inman made the quick decision to have the school police officer escort David from class to the office. James arrived in the office first, and then David with the SRO just after. Mr. Inman brought both boys into his office at once, along with the police officer. He asked them what had taken place. James responded that he had given something to David to hold for him, and then when James was questioned, he started to shake and cry, but did not respond to any questions. So the police officer then searched David and found a pair of brass knuckles, which is a prohibited weapon and considered a felony offense. At this point, David got handcuffed and James stepped in to share the information that he was going to beat David up if he didn't take the knuckles and that they were in fact his. So Mr. Inman thought that this confession would clear David and he would become uncuffed, but that did not happen. The officer explained that both boys were going to jail and being charged with felony possession of a prohibited weapon on school property. In addition, the school policy stated that both students should be expelled for at least 45 days in the district's disciplinary alternative education program, or the DAEP. Richard had been in the center before, but David had never experienced anything like this, and the guilt from Mr. Inman's perspective was starting to set in. The boys were taken to the youth detention facility, and Mr. Inman called both mothers. Richard's mom said she would leave him there for a few days, and David's mom immediately came to the school where Mr. Inman explained the situation and told her he would do everything that he could to help. So Mr. Inman filled out the paperwork on James because he knew that that was what the school policy was. However, he chose not to fill out the paperwork for David, knowing that it was a violation of school and district policy. The following week, David was back in school and James was in the district's DAEP. Mr. Inman received a call from the district office who instructed him to fill out the paperwork on David. Although the director understood Mr. Inman's position, he directed him to fulfill the district policy. Otherwise, Mr. Inman would receive an official reprimand within his file. So some legal or ethical issues. In this case, ethical and legal decision-making was not properly executed. So focusing on legal issues at first, Mr. Inman did not investigate what the teacher saw or why they thought it would classify as probable cause. Seeing students exchange something does not ensure probable cause or reasonable suspicion. It could have been a pencil, an eraser. It could have been anything. This assumption could be viewed as discrimination on James or David, especially if James was known to be a rougher kid. Just seeing him hand something to someone in the hallway could be discrimination instead of reasonable suspicion. So this could be harmful to the teacher who reported it, as well as harmful on both of the boys. Because there was not probable cause, David would need to consent to being searched, which he did not, or at least in the case study that was written, it didn't say anything about him giving consent to the search. So without reasonable suspicion or consent by David, the SRO could be found responsible for the mishap. So that could be harmful to that officer as well. Some ethical issues. Mr. Inman spoke with both boys at the same time with the SRO in the room. So this shows a lack of privacy and also unintentional intimidation, makes getting honest answers and information more difficult. This is super harmful and unfair to David because of the threats that he had received from James, that James finally came clean about. Mr. Inman and the SRO could have acted differently to protect David and kept them separate in hopes for honest answers. Mr. Inman also not following the district policy of reporting David brings questions of ethical decision-making. Mr. Inman is bringing potential harm to himself by not reporting this because he would get a reprimand in his file for not doing it. There is some gray area in this case, so ethical and legal issues can be incredibly complex in their details and their layers. Mr. Inman received information from a concerned teacher and ethically felt that he needed to act. However, questioning the students together breached another ethical line. Additionally, the SRO had no prior knowledge to the situation, so they could have assumed that they needed to ethically search the student, but with more information, maybe the SRO would have acted differently. So there was just a lack of communication there. So both Mr. Inman and the SRO struggled to demonstrate the capacity to evaluate the ethical dimensions of issues, analyze decisions in terms of established ethical frameworks, and communicate ethical and legal decisions with each other and the students involved. So just kind of to put together all of the events, this case centers on a first-year assistant principal who found himself in an ethical and legal decision-making dilemma when two students were brought in together and searched without reasonable suspicion, resulting in both students being arrested and the principal not following up with the district policy of a 45-day suspension. So kind of synthesizing the facts here, we have known facts and we have unknown facts. So the people involved, Mr. Inman, the SRO, James, who's 15, David, who we don't really get his age, but it hints that he's 13, the 5th hour teacher, James's mother, David's mother, the director of secondary education, the place, mostly in the story, it's in the hallway and then in Mr. Inman's office. The program, so it's Rocket Junior High with about 900 students who attend, so it's a large junior high school. The district's disciplinary alternative education program, which would be where the boys would go when they are essentially suspended or expelled out of school. And then some unknown facts. So we don't really know the race of anybody. We don't know any details of the reporting teacher. So there are some things that are left out with the place. We don't know if it's rural or if it's suburban. We don't know the demographics of anyone. We just have some minor details about the students and the people. We know that the south side of town is more rough than maybe where they are, or maybe other places in town. And then the program, we don't know if it's public versus private, if either of the boys have special education services, if they're bilingual. We don't know any of that, which may be important in understanding the case. So reviewing and prioritizing information, could the conflict, situation, or decisions be damaging to the stakeholders or the community? Yeah, the situation can be damaging to stakeholders or community members because the story will get out and people will wonder if everyone is held to the same standards within the school. What individuals and groups have an important stake in the outcome? So the head principal, how assistant principals behave and make decisions impacts the culture of the school. Students who find themselves bullied into something may have fear that this could ruin them as well. Teachers, could reporting something that they find suspicious be discriminatory? Within the district, what happens when one person doesn't follow policy? And then communities or parents, what happens if my kid is bullied into this situation as well? Can I learn more about the situation? So yes, there's still a lot of questions and uncertainty surrounding the reporting teacher. What made her believe that drugs were involved? Is this discriminatory? And was it a discriminatory action that was carried out? What did the SRO know about the situation before they walked into that office? It does not seem like any communication happened, so how could they search? And then, do I know enough to make a decision? How did the lead principal, how does he come into play with the situation? There are so many missing details about the reporting teacher and why she felt there was an exchange of drugs that a decision might be hard to come to. So identifying options. Option 1, Mr. Inman could file no action against David, so he does not serve the 45 days at the AEP, and Mr. Inman would get written up and the reprimand placed in his file. Option 2, Mr. Inman files the report on David and he serves the 45 days at the AEP. Option 3, Mr. Inman files the report on David and they work together to advocate for a lesser sentence in the AEP because of the bullying James did against David. 4, Mr. Inman does not file the report against David and submits a formal written apology and requests to excuse David from the event, citing that Mr. Inman's own misjudgment in modeling ethical behavior in their personal conduct in order to cultivate ethical behavior in others by the example of his mistake. Or 5, Mr. Inman files no action against David and requests that the school board and district work to amend the zero tolerance policy in order to advocate for ethical and legal decisions. So evaluating options, pros for not filing action against David. He wouldn't have anything on his record for making a poor choice because of a threat. He was keeping himself safe and he shouldn't be ruined for that decision. Some cons for not filing action against David. He will not receive punishment for breaking the rules of having a weapon on his possession. In addition, Mr. Inman will receive a reprimand for his own poor decision making. Pros for working on a lesser sentence or a change in policy. David will have a lesser sentence. Mr. Inman can model and cultivate ethical behavior in personal conduct and relationships. Also, changing the policy allows for better solutions if a similar situation were to happen again. Less students will live in fear of being a victim of bullying within this particular setting. Also, cons for changing policy. There might be some pushback from the district and it would be quite a bit of work. So the best option, I believe, is option number 4, where he doesn't file the report against David and submits an apology. So under these complicated and complex circumstances, I believe it's best to not file the report against David, and instead Mr. Inman should submit a written apology and request to excuse David. Mr. Inman did not set up David for success when he brought the SRO and James into the room at the same time. David did not have a safe space to come clean about the situation, and that was a misjudgment on Mr. Inman's part. A student should not be punished for the mistakes of an adult. Mr. Inman has the opportunity to model ethical behavior by admitting his mistake and setting an example for others. However, Mr. Inman should consult with his head principal and district level supervisor before doing anything. So step 1, speak with the head principal and district level supervisors, explaining that ethically and morally you cannot punish David for your actions. Explain that you won't file the report and you will write a formal apology to David and the board to excuse him. Step 2, speak with David and his family, informing them of your decision to make an attempt in making things right. And then also speak with James and his family, informing them of the decision and explaining why David does not have the same punishment as James. Step 3, write the letter explaining to the board that you did not protect David by questioning him with his bully and a police officer in the room. Apologize for your actions and explain that morally you cannot have David be punished. And then if this doesn't work because sometimes people just want you to follow the policy and they don't want to make any special exceptions to the rule, I think a plan B for Mr. Inman would still be not filing the actions against David and just accepting the reprimand in his file because he made the decision to not protect David, and David shouldn't necessarily be fully punished for that. So a very complicated case, but really highlights the importance of thinking through things and behaving in a legal and ethical way and modeling that for your students and your teachers. Thank you for watching.